Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the webinar under the theme Long-Term System Transformation to Enhance the Inclusion of Persons with Disabilities. This is the second in the WebEx Forum series on inclusion of persons with disabilities presented by Employment and Social Development Canada. I would now like to turn the meeting over to James Van Ralt, Director General, Office for Disability Issues, Employment and Social Development Canada. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Bienvenue au webinaire Transformation des systèmes à long terme pour améliorer l'inclusion des personnes handicapées. Ceci est la deuxième séance de la série des forums WebEx au sujet de l'inclusion des personnes handicapées, présentée par Emploi et Développement social Canada. J'aimerais maintenant céder la parole à James Van Ralt, Directeur général, Bureau de la Condition des personnes handicapées, Emploi et Développement social Canada. À vous la parole. Please go ahead.
Thank you. This is James Van Ralte, and as introduced, I am the Director General for the Office with Disability Issues, and I'm pleased to be part of this webinar hosted by our office within Employment and Social Development Canada. I would like to start by saying that if you experience any technical difficulties, please let us know through the online chat or send an email to Gregory Vevers, whose email address is in the invitation for this event. This is an excellent demonstration of the Government of Canada's commitment to advancing the discourse and provides leadership to promote the full inclusion of people with disabilities in Canadian society. People with disabilities are engaged in every facet of Canadian life. They attend school, go to work, support families, and contribute to their communities. Despite this engagement, Canadians continue to treat them differently. We focus on their disability rather than assume their abilities. As ESBC employees, we are well placed to challenge social norms and work towards a more inclusive Canada that celebrates these individuals. I'm pleased today, actually I'm very excited today, to welcome our guest presenters. Ms. Kathy Martin, Vice President Human Resources of Acklands-Grainger Inc. and the Chair of Canadian Business Sensibility, and Ms. Susan Scott Parker, Founder and Chief Executive of Business Disability International. Together, they will discuss how Canadians, governments, businesses, and civil society organizations can work together to transform the way we perceive and interact with people with disabilities in the workplace and in our communities. Today, we're going to start with Kathy Martin. Beyond her role at Acklands-Grainger, Kathy is an advocate for corporations employing persons with disabilities. In 2012, she co-authored a report entitled Rethinking Disability in the Private Sector, which outlined the findings from the Government of Canada's panel on labor market opportunities for persons with disabilities. Kathy was one of 4 individuals appointed to this panel by the Canadian government and then Finance Minister Jim Flaherty. After her experience on the panel, Kathy formed Canadian Business Sensibility, a not-for-profit organization focused on educating corporate leaders about bottom-line business benefits of employing persons with disabilities. She has remained with the organization as the chair of the board. As well, in 2012, Kathy was recognized as a Canadian Diversity Champion by the Women of Influence Advocacy Group. And in 2015, she represented Canada and the Ministry of Employment and Social Development Canada at the 3rd Annual World Assembly for Women with Disabilities that was held in Seoul, Korea. Kathy has also held a series of progressively senior roles in Canadian corporations, Loblaws, and the Canadian Tire Corporation. I'll now turn it over to Kathy for her presentation.
Thank you, James. I appreciate that. And good morning, everyone. I just wanted to take a second to say thank you to everyone on the phone for dedicating some time to this important subject. and also wanted to thank our partners and friends in Ottawa. James, you and the ESBC have been with us for the last few years, and it truly has been a strong partnership, so thank you for hosting this event. As James told you, I got involved with persons with disabilities back in 2013 when I was asked to sit on a panel on behalf of the federal government. And the result of the work from that panel was an awakening for me, to be completely honest. Here I am, a lead of an HR function in some very large Canadian companies, and it was not at all on my radar the importance of hiring people with disabilities, not only from a social economic perspective, but from a business perspective. And in that work, it became really clear that there were three strong stakeholder groups that kind of comprise the issues surrounding employing more Canadians with disabilities. One of those groups is the government area, doing some work around policy, federal, territorial, provincial policy, important stakeholder group. The other stakeholder group out of the three was the agencies, the people across Canada that support families and people with disabilities. And there is a very, very strong agency community alive and well trying to advance the employment of people with disabilities. But the third important stakeholder group is business. And this was not, going back to not on my radar, this was not on my radar at that time. I did not understand the vast talent pool that existed. And so coming out of that report, we decided that we had to stand up an organization that was comprised of business people, business leaders, mostly in corporate Canada, and our purpose was to educate corporate Canada on the values of promoting people with disabilities in the workplace. And standing up SenseAbility back then, we became a one-stop shop for organizations in providing tools and services. On this slide, just stay on this slide for a second, please. I wanted to take a second and talk about the important work of Canadian business sensibility. We're trying to change how people think in business around people with disabilities and including them in the workplace, thinking about them from a consumer perspective, changing the lens. I want you to think about, so forget about the words on this page right now. I want you to think about, in your workplace, who are your best performers? Your best performers, the people that get stuff done, the people that come up with great ideas and great solutions, the people that teach and mentor others. These people that you're thinking about right now come from all walks of life. They're not just white, they're not just able-bodied, they're not single, they're not married, they're everyone. Great performers are everyone. And from time to time, we work around those great performers because they've got accommodation needs. Certain people need to pick up their kids. They're on parent duty, so leaving work early to pick up kids. Some might have elder parent care responsibilities, and so they might need a day off here and there. Others, like our new millennials, might want to leave early for work for a baseball practice. The point is that you as an employer will do anything to work around the needs of your top performers. That's engagement. And so the dialogue with business is less about diversity and inclusion. It's more about leadership. In order for us as a business to truly tap into every single employee and understand what they need, what motivates them, what makes them tick, what keeps them top performers, we have to understand what they need and work around it and be flexible. So the dialogue is very much moving towards a leadership dialogue. And the trick for business is to build a strong people strategy around just that. Now, there is some education to do with people with disabilities. What I learned through the panel work that I did in 2013 is that there is a vast talent pool. And what I also learned is that there is a huge consumer spend. And so that's the trick for business, is to think about building a people strategy that includes these opportunities. You can move to the next slide, please. And so let's take a look at some of the numbers. The next couple of slides are just to give you a sense of the size of the community. And I want you to think about this in two ways. One is through the lens of an employer looking for talent, which we're constantly doing. You see how important LinkedIn is as an example for an employer. And so think about these numbers through the lens of talent pool, but also think about these numbers through the lens of the huge consumer opportunity. So within Canada, based on a 2012 Stats Canada study, 13.7 Canadians self-identified as having a disability. But we believe that that is likely very, very limited, and the actual number is quite a lot larger, probably around the 20% mark. I'll give you a very real example. I have a palsy in my right arm. When I answered the 2012 Stats Canada study, I did not self-disclose as having a disability, simply because on a day-to-day basis, I do not see it as a material issue to my everyday living or my work employment. But yes, bottom line is, I do have a disability, and I do have some workarounds that I've got to accommodate myself. So I would not be in that 13.7 number, and that's why we believe that the number is actually quite a bit higher. The next slide shows actually a few more numbers. And so you can see here that close to 1 in 5 Canadians, and so there's your 20%, have some sort of disability. And the spending power just in Canada is $55.4 billion. And so from a consumer lens, huge, huge opportunity there. But I want to take your eyes down lower in the slide where we talk about digital marketing. And we actually have got a big business opportunity with people with disabilities. We're actually online more in Canada, and persons with disabilities are online. So if the website of an organization is not accessible, this really reduces the opportunity for business from a consumer's perspective. The next slide, please. So what to do about all of this? If you're a company, what do you do with this? Number 1 and number 8 on this list are closely tied together, and I like to think about building a strategy that is a top-down, so executive level, top-down, but also a bottom-up, which is the employee or business resource group. My belief is that an organization that has a little bit of both effort at the top, because if the executive team of the organization does not buy into or understand the opportunities, it won't happen. But at the same time, it can't just be the executive team. Number 8 on that list speaks to local employees self-identifying and coming together as a community within an organization to get some local traction on improvements that might not be made aware at the executive level. For example, in my organization, we actually do have an employee resource group. And that group is coming up with ideas on the website. It's coming up with ideas on how to screen employees, et cetera. Those two things in concert, top down to make sure that it's mandated and that it makes sure that the work gets done, but bottom up keeps it real and keeps traction happening. In my mind, that is a really, really important thing for an organization to do, is the top-down, bottom-up combo. The other one on this list that I wanted to speak to is number 3, communicating why disability inclusion is important to business. You know, one of the things that I learned through the process of the panel is how many myths and perceptions were out there about hiring people with disabilities. The fact that people believe they're expensive because of the accommodation, that they're not safe and hard to follow health and safety rules, that they're litigious and that you can't terminate them for poor performance. All of those things we need to educate in our business, because guess what? All of those things are not true. On average, between $200 to $500 to accommodate a disability. And most of the accommodation, as I spoke to earlier, doesn't even cost you anything. It just costs you flexibility in the workplace. So getting that message, not only what we're doing as an organization, but why it's important to dispel some of those myths, to talk about the huge and vast talent pool that exists, is really, really important in the organization. The other two on this list that I wanted to speak to are number 4 and number 5, which is all about, you know, making sure that you build an inclusion strategy into everything that you do, and that it's not just HR, it's got to be cross-functional. And going back to my earlier comments about this actually being more of a leadership issue than it is an inclusion issue, you need to build a leadership strategy that's all about every one of us, not just people with disabilities, but every one of us. Understanding the nuances of hiring people with disabilities, yes, but it can't be a disability alone strategy. It's got to be about leadership. And so these are some of the things that SensiBility is really working with our partner organizations to help educate and advance. If you go to the next page, this is just a sampling of some of our member organizations. And we have been in existence for just under 2 years, and really, really happy with the progress. We've got many of these are global leaders in their industry. Many of these are global leaders in terms of hiring and engaging people with disabilities. Think about the power of Bell's Let's Talk strategy and how that's changed. It's fundamentally changed. I'm not sure if you feel it, but I certainly feel that the taboo conversations that people shied away from around mental illness are now actually more front and center and accepted. Those are some of the leading edge things that our Canadian organizations are doing. And in terms of government, just going back to government for a second, in Ontario, if you work in Ontario, you're very well aware of the AODA. This is, and for me working in a national organization, I can firmly say that the AODA is leading across the country. It's bold, and it's pushing the accessibility requirements to where they should be. And in fact, it leads across the globe. You think about Canada and the federal level, we have an extremely diverse cabinet. We have women in powerful positions. We have people with disabilities. Carla would be a great example of that. And we have multiple cultures in our cabinet. So in closing, I'm hugely, hugely excited, and I'm humbled to live in Canada where we are pushing the envelope, and I'm humbled to be leading SensiBility. We've never had a better time to advance the hiring and engagement of people with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. And we've had a number of conversations with you and your organization, and I really appreciate the sharing and the insights around the leadership that's required, promoting the business case, not just about talent, but in terms of the customer base and the purchasing power of citizens with disabilities. And I think the part that came through for me was about, in the workplace, we're making adjustments or accommodations for our talent every day, and it's not about disability. It's about supporting our people and making sure that they're productive and providing them with work-life balance and what they need in the workplace. So I think that message about accommodation and adjustment, and it's not just about a person with a disability, is a really strong one. I'm now going to introduce Susan Scott Parker, who has made a career from challenging outdated assumptions regarding both disability as it affects business and the potential of responsible business to adapt respectfully for human reality. Susan is the Executive Officer of Business Disability International and founder and Honorary Vice President of Business Disability Forum in the United Kingdom. The Forum is the world's leading national business disability network. Susan invented the concept and language of disability confidence in the knowledge that if we can change the way people talk about the world, we'll make it easier to change the world. Susan is internationally recognized around the world for her work in advancing the discourse on disability and employment. She continues to build innovative institutions which connect sectors and leaders who would otherwise rarely meet. And most importantly, while she's working out of the United Kingdom, Susan belongs to us. She is a Canadian.
I knew you were going to say that, James. Yes, most importantly, I am Canadian.
Over to you, Susan.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. And so thank you for giving me this opportunity. As I was looking at the theme for this conversation today, I thought I'd like to look at truly at the systemic implications of what we're trying to do, and to look, to kind of apply the experience that we've had, not just working in the UK, but with colleagues in Canada and internationally. I thought I might just start with why business leaders in the UK pioneered this business disability networking as it's developed here, because I think that experience holds true in almost every country I've ever been to. In essence, we were set up as Business Disability Forum because the system fails people with disabilities because it's failing the employer. And what we found was that while on the one hand we had enlightened business leaders saying this is a waste of human potential that we're confronting here, we've got antiquated legislation or unhelpful legislation in country after country, we're still, as a society, positioning disability as an issue to do primarily with doctors and governments, not business. But that while we had business leaders with those sorts of insights saying we know we need to do better, it was actually too hard for the well-intentioned employer to get it right. And I think wherever I go, employers would be saying, it's still too hard to find suitable candidates with disabilities. It's too hard to get the advice and the practical help that managers need, both to remove policy-related obstacles and to learn how to adapt for individuals as potential colleagues and customers. It's too hard to define best practice, which lifts above the legal compliance message, which is usually most unhelpful, as in, I'm only going to treat you properly if I have to. And there isn't a single employer I know that wants to communicate that. But all too often, legal compliance messaging subverts what the well-intentioned companies are trying to achieve. And I think what we see in terms of systems is that often governments, public policymakers, agencies that are funded to help disabled people into work justify the poor results. Some organizations will routinely get only 10 or 20% of their job seekers into jobs. They justify these poor results by the low expectations they have of people with disabilities themselves, and, of course, by blaming the employer as the problem in the system. And so I was reminded of a story told in Vancouver of a local employer who agreed to give a job to someone with a mental health condition. The agency said they'd be there to support. But what the community agency hadn't told the employer was that the person was going into a receptionist job, and yet the prime way in which their disability affected them was they had an intense dislike for meeting strangers. And so when it didn't work, because of course a receptionist has to meet strangers every day, the agencies were blaming the employer in a way that leaves us kind of stuck, and nobody knows what to do. And so what we found was that we had employers rarely meeting people with disabilities rarely meeting business leaders, and they were miles apart, if you like, with a range of agencies and public bodies in the middle. So we said, what would be different if employers were to collaborate to create something that challenges not just the way in which the business community thinks and operates, but actually by linking employers and disabled people directly, starts to drive change across the entire system. So the approach that we took was very practical. In effect, companies were joint funding a small expert team whose job it was to make it easier for them as corporations to deliver the best practice that everyone wants to see. We understood very quickly that as Kathy says, it's not an HR responsibility as such, unless IT get it right, and property and procurement and communications and the guys in marketing and market research, new product development, unless the entire business ups its game and develops the necessary disability expertise, all the aspirations in the world to recruit or employ more people with disabilities aren't going to get us where we want to go. And so what we're seeing now is that actually increasingly as large corporations understand that, we get initiatives like the Technology Task Force, which brings chief information officers and chief technology officers together to look at what they need to do to ensure that the technology truly does liberate contribution and productivity, and of course access for customers. And they've now, they produced some time ago a maturity model, which is available to any CIO in Canada who wants to measure the extent to which they truly have removed the IT-related obstacles, to measure their performance in terms of accessibility and usability across the entire business. Those are the sorts of practical tools driven by function heads, if you like, that really drive business improvement in such a way that, of course, disabled people also benefit. And we're seeing with companies like Cisco and the story they're telling of 38 blind engineers now working in India, that it was driven by line manager demand for talent and for creative thinking about how to build that talent pipeline, not driven by HR and certainly not driven by diversity. So again, I stress, the need here is for practical help, and the reason that the Business Disability Network focused there is, of course, that most employers do not have practical help readily available. So we created the first helpline for managers and a whole range of practical guidance on how you make adjustments or accommodation for particular people with particular impairments. We have millions of those guides in use, which tells us something about the gap, if you like, in the information that's available to the business and to the public sector as employer. We developed the first corporate standard because unless you can describe best practice, well, it makes it very difficult to get there. And we have seen that standard now adapted by the Australian network, by the Saudi network, and we're in conversations with Vienna and various other organizations because, of course, while the fundamentals remain the same, it does need to be adapted for local reality. And we're now convening procurement professionals to take a look at piloting an IT tender tool that would make it easier for procurement to ask the right questions when purchasing hardware, software, IT-related services, given the complexity of the standards that are out there which procurement don't use. So, as I reflected on what we've learned about promoting culture change, the systemic change that lies at the heart of the conversation today, we see a huge opportunity for public policymakers to drive the shift that says they would only fund organizations to help people with disabilities into jobs when they position the employer absolutely as a valued customer. It's only then that you can move into partnership. You can't work in partnership with a business if you take 3 weeks to answer a phone call when a manager asks for help, for example. There's a terrific transformation immediately seen in any system when the employer finds it easier to fill particular vacancies with particular suitable candidates with disabilities. So getting that balance right between offering a recruitment service to the employer and offering, tailored placement assistance to individuals. And yes, the business needs to learn how to adapt policies and procedures and the built environment, etc. But the only way to promote real culture change is by enabling the face-to-face conversations, contacts between business leaders and people with disabilities that cause all the stereotypes on both sides of the table to fall by the wayside. And so some of the things we've done that have made a huge impact: leadership development programs for disabled social entrepreneurs, bringing them into the companies so that they are learning alongside corporate managers on courses, whether it's on marketing or leadership development or managerial skills. We've seen terrific success with work experience programs, internships, and so on, proven over 10 years, for example, in Australia with their Stepping Up program. We've got examples like Project Search, where individuals who are a long way from the world of work yet come in for a 9-month extended internship program on the employer premises, so that while they're learning, their colleagues in the business are being challenged on a daily basis to just discard the assumptions they were making before the program moved in. And of course, we've got companies that are involving disabled customers as advisors and champions. Lloyd's Banking Group here have an ambassador who is a dignified, articulate gentleman, one of their customers who has dementia. And so as their dementia ambassador, he's going to the branches, he's talking to their people, he's helping them to understand how best to meet his needs and the needs of, well, in this country, nearly 1 million people with dementia who are still, of course, accessing banking services through various ways. So as I was looking at the systemic issues, I really wanted to stress the importance of this face-to-face work, because we have found beyond doubt that it's by bringing business leaders together with people with disabilities as leaders, experts in their field, as peers and as interesting individuals. That's where the real key learning takes place. That's where you get change on both sides. And that's where together they can turn to governments and to NGOs and to the disability sector, if you like, and say, actually, you need to make it easier for both the business and me as a disabled person to access services which meet both our needs, because that is so absolutely fundamental. And so in closing, I guess I just wanted to say there were some things that I've picked up in Canada that I really wanted to point out in this conversation. One is you get these lovely examples of really innovative practice, like the President's Group, bringing very senior players together in British Columbia. Wouldn't it be marvelous to have a way for every province to have a similar network and somehow connect them through a President's Group level of chief executives, forming an informal association, if you like, at federal level, which can then be involved actively in promoting the kind of new discrimination legislation that I know you're crafting in a way that is seen to be credible to both business and people with disabilities. Another thought I had was that I found in a recent visit to Newfoundland that the language of accommodation was proving to be quite unhelpful. It seemed to be special treatment just for people with disabilities. If there was some way across Canada to start to get the message out that actually the companies need, the businesses and public sector employers need to understand the task is to make it easier for everyone to do their jobs, for everyone to develop their careers. And that means the corporation has to have the requisite disability expertise, the know-how, to make sure that the company adapts so that they can actually maximize the productivity of the entire workforce, including people with disabilities. And so somehow, and I'd be very interested in comments from our listeners, how do we shift this assumption that accommodation is only for disabled people? It's special treatment, which triggers resentment, and when actually it's how we treat people fairly, because if there's anything we've learned, it's you only treat people fairly now by treating them differently. And I suppose, finally, I just wanted to say we need to find a way to bring the understanding that it's not enough for the business or not enough for the employer to change their behavior. Every player in the process has to also look long and hard at how they can radically change the way they do things, radically challenge their assumptions. If we're going to see the numbers of people with disabilities coming through the system radically lift over, from the 10 to 20% finding jobs with many agencies, to it actually being a process where employers know they can fill vacancies routinely with talented and suitable disabled candidates by accessing an efficient labor market, which means, of course, that, as I say, everyone has to raise their game. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. And now I'm going to turn the floor over to our facilitator, who will walk us through how we're going to manage the question and answer period.
Thank you. We will now take questions from the telephone lines. If you have a question and are using a speakerphone, please pick up your handset before making your selection. If you have a question, please press *1 on your telephone keypad. You may at all times cancel your question by pressing the # key. Please press *1 now if you have a question. There will be a brief pause while participants register. Thank you for your patience.
And while we're waiting for that, I do have a question that's come in from the online chat. So our facilitator is going to manage the phone line questions, and they've given me, questionably, responsibility for managing the online chat questions. So while those questions are coming in, we'll probably go back and forth, maybe 1 or 2 questions each. But I have a question about measurable outcomes. Kathy, you raised this idea about measurable outcomes. Are you talking about, or do you mean targets? And is there a better way of measuring success, especially when it comes to governments?
Okay, I did not mean targets. My personal belief is that organizations should hire the best person possible and not be overshadowed by the desire to hit a specific target. Having said that, though, organizations have got to cast a wide net when they are looking for the best talent possible. And so when I talk about measured success in an organization, one of the things that we're doing at SensiBility is when you become a member, you actually, we take a baseline of where that organization is in terms of an assessment. Think of it as an assessment, an audit, and we take a look at a whole bunch of different things: the strategy of the organization, the tools and internal HR processes, the technology, a variety of things. And as we take a look at that organization, we figure out how accessible are they? How open are they to bringing and attracting new talent that comes from the PWD world? And how open and attractive are they from a consumer power perspective? And that baseline provides the organization an idea of where they are and where they need to go in terms of improvement. So for me, it's more around that kind of measurement, because from that assessment, you put together with the organization a strategy. Wow, we're pretty strong in strategy, but our tools and internal processes completely inhibit us. So let's really go hard on those tools and processes and put a plan in place and measure success there. My preference is to actually manage measurement and success that way than it is through targets, because for me, that's meaningful change. When you do it the way that I just described, it's harder, no question, but it's systemic change that will last a lot longer.
Thank you. We'll go back to the phone lines.
Thank you. We do have a question from John Ray from the Council of Canadian Disabilities. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Actually, it's a comment. I found, Susan, your comments very refreshing in two particular respects. One, your idea of bringing disabled people face-to-face to work together with employers, because too often the only people they tend to talk to are the agencies, who I don't think, and I don't think that's enough. I like your approach better. Secondly, your rather holistic approach in realizing that areas like procurement and developing accessible IT services and those sorts of things, that those issues are also critical in paving the way to make hiring decisions possible. So thank you for your refreshing intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. We do have another question from Denise Williams from CIBC. Please go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I guess my question is to both of you, just in general. CIBC has made a strong movement toward hiring people with disabilities, and I'm not in HR. I'm actually an editor, so this is not my thing. But I'm on the workability committee at CIBC, and so the way I see it, there are just so many different departments in such a large organization as this. What recommendations do you make to a company so big to make sure that everyone is moving in the right direction to meet those goals?
Can I come in on that?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. I think there's two sides of this for me. One is I saw the chief exec of Lloyd's Banking Group say at the House of Lords recently, he's got three processes. He has to bring people in with talent, he has to make them productive, and he has to sell stuff. I think he phrased it somewhat more elegantly. But he had three business processes. And so when he learned from his employees that the process involved in making his employees productive was taking months and months and months to deliver poor quality accommodation stroke adjustments, he decided that it was his priority to fix that. So I think it's when you take it high enough in the business to find a senior business leader who says, I need to make sure that the process that brings people in and the process that enables them to do their job well and the process that sells stuff, that they take that responsibility. It makes a huge difference. I think, though, the other thing is to find models for interdepartmental collaboration. And so that 10-point framework that I showed in my slides is a framework that says these are the different things that need doing in terms of departments and so on. And GlaxoSmithKline has put together a global council that has their head of property and their head of communications and their head of technology and their head of manufacturing who's leading it, coming together in a council tasked with improving their performance in terms of those three processes. And it's making a huge difference, as you can imagine. They're trying to do that at global level to get consistent best practice. And actually, I think, Denise, one final thought, I find that if you bring people with logistics expertise or lean systems thinking in to say, how do we cut the time and effort involved from the moment someone says, I need an accommodation till I've got it, that you get far more effective solutions than if you bring someone in from, I don't know, HR or diversity or whatever, because it is fundamentally a re-engineering of a process task, and it brings fresh business interest in because they can start to quantify the results because they've cut waiting times from 6 months to 3, or they've got their waiting times from 3 months down to 14 days from the moment someone says, I need an adjustment, to having it delivered and working. And they cut costs, and they can document all those cost savings to the business because they looked at it as a logistics challenge. And as I say, it's worked brilliantly.
Kathy, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just add from my perspective, I'll go back to the comments I made about kind of the strategy in an organization, because CIBC is very, very, similar in size to many of our member organizations and ones that I've worked in the past. And that's why a top-down, bottom-up approach is the best, because it can be overwhelming, and it is overwhelming if you only think about creating change system-wide out of the gate. So I think it's important to have a top-down strategy, but I also think it's important to start locally where the organization has identified specific requirements or needs. So for example, the Walgreens example that I'm sure everyone knows about started in their distribution environment. It did not go enterprise-wide until now. And it started because of a very real business requirement of high turnover in a distribution environment. And let's test this out and see if we can bring down our turnover, which they did, and saw great results. And therefore, then it went system-wide. So my thinking is kind of that top-down, bottom-up is the best way to get traction in some of the larger organizations where change occurs not overnight.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I have 5 or 6 questions in the queue online, but I think we'll try and do 2 telephone and then 2 online. So I'm wondering if there's a second telephone question.
Thank you. We do have a last question on the phone from Sherry Torgman from Caledon Institute. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you both for your presentations. I was wondering, Susan, if you could talk to us very briefly about the BC President's Group, because you mentioned that perhaps it should be a model for, the kind of discussion that we should be having elsewhere in the country. And I was just wondering who convenes them, and are they self-appointed, and is there a staff supporting process involved, and who funds them, and what are some of their conversations? So just very briefly, if you could speak about that, that would be helpful.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Fine. Well, I know it came about when we were working together on the BC strategy, the 12-point strategy that they launched, 4 or 5 years ago now? I've lost track of time. I know the senior official involved is Molly Henderson, and it was set up, I think, originally. We positioned it as senior business leaders acting as an advisory group to the Premier of British Columbia on how to maximize the impact of their strategy. And then from that, of course, it evolved into a group that has chief executives involved who are now looking at how do they make it easier for their own companies to deliver the best practice, and how can they help British Columbia to transform the community agencies so that they're more effective in terms of meeting the needs of the business community as well as those of disabled people. And so I'd be happy, perhaps, Paulette, we can send contact details from Molly out to anyone who's interested in looking at the way it works there. From my experience with the President's Group that we created in the UK, an informal group of very senior people who come together to generate new ideas, if you like, to explore a different strategic and communication environment that would make it easier for both their companies and governments to move forward, if you like, in a new way. And I just think, as the work I was doing in Newfoundland recently, that the climate might be right for these kinds of players to come together in other provinces, but I just don't know if that's realistic.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and we'll make sure we can help make those connections, both Susan and Sherry.
Thank you, Jane.
I have, as I said, I have a couple of questions in the queue from the online chat. There's interest. I guess, in the Canadian context about trying to address the special challenges around employment for persons with disabilities coming from Indigenous and or rural or remote communities where employment prospects there are challenging even to begin with. And if there's been any insights from either BDI or Sensibility on those challenges. And maybe I'll start with Kathy.
Yeah, I don't have anything specific there other than I see the Indigenous peoples as another talent pool, whether they have a disability or not. It's an untapped talent pool in Canada. And again, kind of going back to my earlier comments about this being actually a leadership issue and not an inclusion issue, I think we have to get business leaders with their heads around, how do I hire the best person possible? And that best person comes in a whole bunch of different shapes, sizes, and colors. And that's the work we've got in front of us, because our talent pool is extremely vast in Canada, and yet it's not on the radar. And that's some of the work of Sensibility, is the education around that. I don't know, Susan, if you've got any thoughts.
Well, I think, we've been looking at this in terms of how global companies ensure that the diversity and inclusion industry, if you like, doesn't get in the way here, because there's a widespread tendency to address these groups as separate and distinct. So you've got women, you've got over 50s, ethnic minorities, Aboriginal people. And what we're saying is you have disabled women and disabled over 50s and disabled ethnic minorities, etc. And that what's needed here is to make sure that you've removed the disability-specific obstacles that are in your control. And you do that by, talking directly to people in the remote regions to get an understanding of the journeys they take as they try to prepare for and find work and the obstacles they encounter, while matching that journey analysis with analyzing the processes that the employers are using locally, so that you spot the obstacles that are in the control of public policy. So it could be transport. You spot the obstacles in the control of the employer. It could be online recruitment. And online recruitment is notoriously discriminatory all over the world for people who are, for various reasons, struggling to get through. And it could be a process like requiring everyone to do panel interviews instead of letting them prove what they can do in a job tryout. And so the point is that once you've removed the disability-specific obstacles, then a disabled person in the rural community is at least in the same start point as anybody else in that rural community. But if you just regard them as part of some category of human beings branded rural dwellers, then anything that works for rural dwellers will still leave the disabled rural dweller behind. So that journey analysis becomes crucial, and I don't know who would lead that work in Canada. Would that be James?
I might have a role to play.
Does that make sense? I mean, did that make sense?
I think so. I think that's. I don't think there's a one size fits all on that part of the discussion, Susan.
Indeed. Yeah.
I'm conscious of the time. I had a little panic. I thought we had a little more room, and then I actually looked at my watch. That's not necessarily the sign of a strong moderator, but I'm going to go to what I think may be the last question, and then we'll probably have to close it off. There's a question about the effectiveness or the priority in terms of training all employees within an organization regarding inclusion and persons with disabilities, and whether you see that as an objective or having an impact. And maybe I'll start with Kathy.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer in training, because it builds, but training in a holistic way. So meaning, why is this important to us? Not just what the organization wants to do, but how they want to approach it and why it's important. I just think that that context is missing in business. And so I'm a strong believer in getting folks at all levels educated and aware, especially in topics where strong myths reside, so that we can build knowledge and understanding.
Any perspective, Susan?
I agree. I think I'm moving to a point where I'm interested also in ensuring that the Training and Development Department infiltrate appropriate disability-specific competencies into the training they're running routinely. So you're running courses in how to do performance management. You infiltrate case studies. How do you do the performance management when you think this person's performance is affected by, say, mental health condition or a disability? Mm-hmm. You're running courses on how to manage difficult conversations with employees. Well, what if the difficult conversation might have a disability dimension? Courses in well-being and resilience. Mm-hmm. You know, you look at the way you're building the management capability of the organization and just making sure that whenever you're talking about managing people, the training program includes people with disabilities, just as it would include all and any other employee. But there are specific competencies that need to be factored in. And I think as I look back, I rarely see anyone from a training department at an event talking about disability and business. I don't know where they are. But it's time that they came to the table, I think.
I couldn't agree more. So I'd like to wrap up by thanking everyone for joining us today on this webinar, and I hope you have all found the time spent to be very informative and productive. On behalf of all of us at Employment and Social Development Canada, I'd like to sincerely thank Kathy and Susan for sharing their time and experience and insights with us. We've had an engaging first start at a discussion, and we need to keep the discussion going on this very important topic. And I'd like to thank all of our audience members for your time and attention and for the thoughtful questions that we were able to take. I've received some feedback in terms of future topics for webinars, people who would have liked to have seen or heard the perspective of both organized labor and employees with disabilities on that issue. So I think we'll add those topics to our list for future webinars. And finally, I'd like to say that the transcript and recording of this webinar will be available in due time for all of those that are interested in sharing it just beyond the time that we have today, and that all of you will be receiving a short survey from us with a few questions for feedback about the webinar, and we'd appreciate your time in filling that out. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.